Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christine Chin. It is my pleasure to welcome you or welcome back to the Inclusive Leadership Conference. I would like to thank you for joining us for this afternoon session, Inclusion and Safe Zone. So who here is excited to get started? Okay, so I see some of you are here in the chat. I see excitement for some of our other workshops. But anyway, we are more than excited to welcome our breakout session speaker, Dr. Martin Tease. Dr. Martin L. Tease is a coordinator for the Office of Inclusion, Multicultural, and LGBTQIA+ Student Services at Northern Arizona University. Since assuming the role, Dr. Tease works to help direct leadership for and involvement in developing and overseeing mentoring programs to support students of color and to support the LGBTQ+ community. Prior to returning to Northern Arizona University, Dr. Tease worked in TV and film production, development, creative affairs, community relations, and outreach. He returned to education in order to complete a master's degree and then doctorate at the University of East Anglia in the United Kingdom, focusing on areas of TV film-based practice, documentary, issues of diversity, inclusion, and oral history. In his current role, Dr. Tease leads various programs and events engaging film screenings, diversity dialogues, heritage programs, and co-facilitates training emphasizing diversity and inclusion, bias, safe zone, transgender awareness, and international study and travel abroad. Dr. Tease has collaborated with various colleagues to help bring guest lecturers and speakers to campuses, including journalist and media pundit Dr. Mark Lamont Hill and Mitchell Martin, directors John Morris and Sean Anders, Melina Matsauskas and Spike Lee, writer Kevin Wilmot, entertainment consultant Jeff Johnson, comedians Damon Wayans, Jerry Seinfeld, Jeff Foxworthy, and the former Senior Vice President of Diversity at NBC, Deborah Langford. Among other recognitions, Dr. Tease was the American Scholar in Residence for the Second Air Division Memorial Library in Norwich, United Kingdom, received an Outstanding Distinction Award for outreach and work as an Assistant Program Manager for the Prince's Trust Youth Development Program, in addition to being awarded and recognized as the Director for the Murdoch Community Outreach Programs and Muir, focusing on the history of African American residents in Northern Arizona. Can I see some excitement in the chat? I see Josh Archer is excited to be here. Woo, Amanda. Yep, we're so excited to have you at ILC today. I'm glad to see the excitement from Osama. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Martin Tease.
Hey, everybody. Thank you. Thank you. You know, it's so funny, Christine, you were reading that, and I was like, who is she talking about? Is she talking about me? So yeah, no, thank you for that. And I'm very glad to be here. Before we get started, I know I'm packing in a lot of information that normally is about 3.5 hours in a workshop in various capacities. So I want to get started with a video real quick. Mind you, we always talk about the fact that when we play videos and we play certain content, it could be triggering. You might hear some things that may make you mad, may make you upset. The purpose for us is to talk about it. And so I'm going to get started and we'll go from there.
Ready on the stop? Okay, here we go. I am somebody. I am somebody. I may be poor, but I am somebody. I may be young, but I am somebody. I may be on welfare, but I am somebody. I may be small, but I am somebody. I may make a mistake, but I am somebody. My clothes are different. My face is different. My hair is different. But I am somebody. I am black, brown, white. I speak a different language, but I must be respected, protected, never rejected. I am God's child. I am somebody. Give yourself a big hand. Really on?
Hey everybody. So I wanted to play that, and I wanted to play that because that was one of the things that I heard from my parents, and then also from Jesse Jackson while growing up. And the whole basis of that was for me to never think that I was better than anyone else, but that no one was also better than me, and that from all the different perspectives, we grew up in a very multicultural environment, although we were a traditional African-American Black family. It was about not understanding who we were, appreciating our culture, but as well as appreciating others. So I am somebody, for me, for that was a great way to kind of start off this conversation, because it really is about trying to understand the multicultural essence of who we are, and then actually helping us move beyond that hashtag. So with that said, and there were some things that, you know, it was dated. This is probably the 70s or the 80s. It was Sesame Street. The Afros were rocking it. So I really liked that, and I thought it was a great way for us to start off. Again, I do want to thank Christine and Amanda and Sarah and everyone for putting this on and allowing me to be here. I want to give shouts out and props to my boss, Dr. Ivy Banks and Marion Griffin, who actually helped bring me into NAU and got me a part of the process of being with the multicultural students. And then I also want to thank you for being here and listening to me as we go on. There's a lot to discuss. And so one of the things that, if you can see the screen right now, one of the things I wanted to show you is that we do zone trainings. And so one of the things that we do as part of the inclusion zone and the safe zone, we also have transparency zone. We also have one on bias, and we also have one on dream zone. And all of those talk about different facets of identity and all on those intersections. And so what I wanted to do for this conference and to get us beyond the hashtag was to kind of incorporate what we do in inclusion zone and safe zone, which one aspect talks about multiculturalism, and then the other aspect gets into LGBTQIA plus students and their concerns and their issues, right? So moving right along, I did send some messaging to the organizers, and I sent some articles. I also gave them some definitions and a few videos that I couldn't fit in for this time. So what I'm going to try to do with that is I'm not going to talk about microaggressions, and I believe someone did a topic on advocacy and allyship. So I'm not going to focus so much on that in my conversation, but I do want you to keep in the back of your mind, you know, there are things like microaggressions, there's things like tokenism, imposter syndrome, that all play a part and impact what it is that I'm going to be talking about. But there's definitions that I put in there in a couple of videos that I think will also help get you there. And then at the same time, you know, what I'm going to do today is really kind of blend our 3-hour sessions on inclusion and safety zone into one small part where I'm going to talk about cultural competency and cultural dexterity. And then I'm going to move over into an inclusive language to kind of hybrid the two, right? So you can see how that works. Now, normally when we do our programs, we have rules, right? And the rules that we have is that, one, this is a judgment-free zone, right? We want you to think about questions. You know, this is a place for you to be able to ask the questions. And in this case, if I don't get to it, send them in the chat and we can try to answer them that way. Christine, if you can pick those up. I can't see them while I'm in the presentation mode, but if anything is glaring and jumps out, just stop and shout and holler at me. That will be good. But mind you, at the same time, when we're having these training and these dialogues and we're talking about moving beyond hashtags and understanding what that is, we also always tell our students that, you know, minds are like parachutes. They're best when they're open. Then at the same time, because we are talking about such information that can be triggering and can make someone upset or can be mad because we hold these positions, we also want you to know that this is, we always say to people that, you know, there's no comfort in the growth zone, but at the same time, there's no growth in the comfort zone. So it's gonna, you know, if it gets personal, it gets personal. But what we want you to remember too, when we do these dialogues, this isn't a debate. Nobody's trying to win anything here. And if anybody is trying to win something, win the lottery, send me some money, please. I'm trying to retire, you know, live a life of luxury. But if that's the case, you know, that's the only kind of winning that we want to talk about. But when we're talking about inclusion and when we're talking about diversity, I mean, when we're talking about looking at how we can become aware and advocates and allies, we want to understand that we're not debating. we are dialoguing. And the difference between the two, one is trying to win and point out flaws and weaknesses to prove their point. The dialogue really is about us getting together and listening so we can have a multicultural understanding of where and which we're coming from. When we move from there, again, what we want to talk about is we want to recognize that in this training, as you move forward with the conference, this is about recognizing collective and collaborative knowledge, and at the same time, respecting diverse perspectives and experiences. So if I don't get through the entirety of this workshop because of the time frame, what I want to leave you with, the discussion that I want you to have in the back of your mind as you move forward, going on to be whoever and whatever it is that you do, is that I always want people to understand that before you can become an ally, before you can become an advocate, you have to be aware, right? And how do you become any of those things if you're not aware of what you're talking about? But at the same time, aware of those things that will inform you and impact you so that you can move beyond the hashtag, right? And it doesn't matter necessarily what your role is. That should be taken into consideration. But who are you and what do you do? How are you aware? And then how does that help you move into allyship or advocacy if that's what you're choosing to do? So Inclusion Zone and Safe Zone have some objectives. Our objectives when we're giving either presentation is basically to help you to become aware and to understand, right? There's language, there's terminology, there's history, there's intersections, there's differences. We want you to understand those things. At the same time, we want to inspire you to start learning and encouraging you to look at those things that are differences, but yet similarities at the same time. But then we also ask you to explore your intersections, your communities, and the inclusivity of them all. And at the same time, it's a call to action. What are you going to do, right? How are you going to become competent so that you're not only just aware, but you can move into the aspects of advocacy and you can move into being an ally, or what those mean and how those work to help then do whatever it is that you're choosing to do at the time, right? So let's jump right in. And so the first aspect of Inclusion Zone that we really start talking about is cultural awareness, right? We're talking cultural awareness, we're talking understanding, we're talking competency, but we're also talking respect. And how do all of those things intertwine so that you move beyond the hashtag, but you start focusing in on those differences? Now, one of the things about the Jesse Jackson video with doing I Am Somebody, again, I say it's dated. We're looking at the afros, although I think some of that has kind of come back, into fad and fashion. But, he was calling out names and he was saying people. But some of the stuff that he didn't say looked, it was adapted for people today. So, right, he didn't say anything about sexual orientation. He did mention religion, but we know there's people who don't have, who don't believe in religion or who believe differently. Right, that's okay. That the process of saying that I am somebody isn't necessarily about excluding anyone, but it's about bringing in and embracing all those differences. And again, we're looking at what he did then compared to now. So I thought that still was a good way to segue into this discussion and topic. But at the same time, when we're talking about inclusion and we're looking at cultural competency, we're going to start placing all of these things as a factor, right? How do they start impacting what we understand and what we do so that we can become more aware and culturally competent? Now, the definition that we use for inclusion, again, is about the act of creating the environments, the individuals and groups to help make them feel welcome, respected, supported, and valued, and able to fully participate, right? And then we also want to think about the climate that embraces all these differences and respects people. But the second part of that, that the first was probably more about the individual. The second part, we're also talking about our institutions, right? And the organizational strategies and practices that help promote all of these interactions, whether they be academic, whether they be interpersonal, whether they're in the public sector or private sector. It's really about how we're starting to help people to understand and to become more inclusive. And again, if I do not get through the entire course of what I'm talking about today, I want to just remind you and leave you with these 3 key aspects to help, and I think this speaks to the conference, it speaks to the leadership of moving past the hashtag. Are you aware? If ally is your goal, if advocacy is your goal, it starts with awareness. So those 3 things I think are the keys. And to be aware, that means that you listen first. At the same time, when you move into ally and advocacy, that means that you start turning that listening into action. And if you can see the quote from Helen Keller here, one of the things we use this quote is to really help kind of fulfill that and move that mission, to let you know that, if your role, and we talk about social justice and inclusion and equity, which is different between diversity and equality in many aspects. But when we're looking at that well-roundedness of inclusion, and when we start talking about equity, we use this quote for Helen Keller about the great masses. And, until people have that responsibility, then nothing can be attained until all of those things come together, right? So moving into that, I mentioned diversity. And again, that kind of goes with our inclusion zone. When we're talking multiculturalism, we talk diversity, we talk equity, and then we talk inclusion, right? And if you look at this picture, here, you see bags of sand, right? They look like they're proportioned, they look like they're measured evenly. That's diversity, right? That's there. But then you take that sand and you throw it out on the table because you're getting ready to create. But then you have to ask yourself, what do you have, right? You have a bunch of colored sand. What is it doing? What is it saying? And then the next picture is what happens when you put all of them together, right? So when we talk inclusion, what we are talking about is how all and every piece of that sand comes together to make a vital picture, right? And that picture then has all of them working in tandem together to make the beautiful picture that you see before you. So that's what we're talking about when we're looking at inclusion. But when we come back and we start thinking about the hashtag, right? Why are we here today? We think about the hashtag. In order to move beyond it, and when we start talking about bias, we're looking at the unconscious bias and the conscious bias we have. We're looking at how do the isms of the world, right? Racism, sexism, classism, ableism, transphobia, homophobia, you name it. How do they all start working and impacting us, and what we think we know and how we interact and what it is that we do. But then, and the systems that we're in. So for me, we're talking education. So I'm in an educational institution. How does all that work to impact faculty, students, and staff, right, on campus? But then not to mention, how is it perpetuated? How is it perpetuated by the school? How is it perpetuated by the students? How is it perpetuated by the staff? So we're looking at that. And for us to really start diving into that, we have to start looking inclusively, right? So we say we got to go from diversity to equality to inclusion. And one of the reasons why we talk about that is because when students complain about Northern Arizona University, and I'm sure if they have complaints about Temple, if they have complaints about any of the universities that they go to, generally it's not about the institution itself, right? It snows in Flagstaff. We're 7,000 square feet up in elevation. There's wilderness, there's hiking. Those aren't my complaints. It's not stuff that I do, but those are not my complaints about Northern Arizona or Northern Arizona University. My complaint, if I have one about Northern University, or my students have one, it's about how members of the faculty or the staff make them feel, right? How does that impact them that way? So when we're looking at this, we need to start looking inclusively, thinking about what it is, who we have on campus, but then who are we? What positions do we have, right? What's our positionality in this case? And that's an honest assessment, right? And sometimes it may not be as comfortable as we want it to be, because we have to start recognizing and looking at our bias, our conscious bias, our unconscious bias. From there, we start talking about taking a selfie. And in this course, what we're talking about is a cultural dexterity. And what we mean by that is it's how we're taking culture and bringing it to the campus climate in this case, but then how are we taking the knowledge and the emotional intelligence and interpersonal skills to relate to our students, to relate to the staff, to relate to the parents who come, if there's, come to celebrate when they graduate, or sometimes come to complain when there's some complaints to be had. But we're trying to understand, how do we relate into this mass, of cultural mixing that comes to campus, and how do we fit that climate, right? And this, again, is an honest assessment. So let me break it down to you on how I did this assessment and how I talk about it. So when we do my selfie, my name is Martin. I was born after Martin Luther King. I was born on his birthday. I'm single, but I'm actively looking. So, I'm taking offers, I guess. If there's some people, send them my way and we'll talk about it. But I'm also a son. I'm a brother. I am an uncle. My nickname is Marty for short, but so for some of my friends, they call me Party, and we don't need to talk about that, but that's okay because we would have a good time. At the same time, I'm an advocate. I'm now an ally, and I'm a supporter. I'm a friend. I'm an advocate for multicultural and LGBTQIA plus, student services and studies and representation. But at the same time, and this is where it's going to get tricky, right? And somebody might get upset and it might cause a couple of ripples, but if you can see each other, I want you to look around and start looking at who's probably on the call or thinking about yourself. Or even as you try to make this selfie for yourself, I talk about the biggest thing for me in my selfie is that one of the things that I am is under the influence, not only of white supremacy, but under prejudice, conscious and unconscious bias, discrimination, and racism at the same time. Now, what do I mean by that? And I did say supremacy, and that's the root of it all, right? So I said white supremacy, but at the base of that is supremacy. And for some of those people, and for some people, when we're having these trainings, this makes them upset, right? They get like, oh my God, he said white supremacy. Oh, he's saying, he's blaming us for everything. And no, I'm not. What I'm basically saying is that these are systems, right? These are things that are out there that are impact me as a person. They impact how I've navigated, the world that I've been around. And so when we look at that and we look at the definition of supremacy, what we're talking about are all the synonyms that come in with that, right? And it's about the ability of one to think that in their authority, they have dominance, superiority, they have power, they have control, right, over you and how they relate to you. And so what we do is that we start trying to bring that down so people can understand that. And we talk about the Constitution, right? And we talk about the United States, we the people, right? But when we talk about we the people and we start thinking about the Constitution and the freedoms and the rights and the liberties that we all have, do we really have them? Rhetorical question there. Do we really have them on the basis of who were the founding fathers, right? Who were the people that orchestrated and put the Constitution together? Who were the ones that were talking about the freedom and liberties? And in the rhetorical nature of that question, right, there is this bad, right? And is this bad not because, we say that it is, or not because things have adapted and changed over the course of time, but we have to think about when that was there and how that impacts us, right? As things have changed, what did that mean? Who were they creating the Constitution for? Who had these liberties to the right to pursuit of happiness, right? Who was all that? And who was left out at the table if you're looking at that picture? And at the same time, while you're looking at it, we may be talking about, and I go back to the fact that I said white supremacy, right? I said white supremacy, but if you look at that and you start putting this into context and you start thinking about it, these people also impacted white people, right? If you were not white, if you were not a male, if you were not heterosexual, if you did not have money, if you were not Christian, if you were not a man, right? Were you included in their original thoughts and ideas about freedoms and liberties, right? And those are the things that we have to start thinking about when we do this selfie, as we're looking at how do we individually relate to cultural expressions, but at the same time, what does that make us feel and how do we interact? But that, again, you impact and think about the organization of the United States, right? We want you to think about that. We want to think about how it was organized. We want you to think about the power shifts, right? We've had amendments. Let some history books tell it. Some of us were slaves, and then we marched for freedom, and now we're free. So, is that true, right? At the same time, where are the shifts, right? We had women's liberation. We've had gay liberation. We've had all these different aspects, of bringing us into a more equitable environment. And yet, as much has changed, more still has to happen because we still see isms and things that impact us, right? So when we start talking about our institution and we're looking at the institutions going back real quick, is that we start then thinking about how did we as an institution, or how did the founding of the United States of America impact all of these things, right? And were we included? Were we included in the housing? Were we included in the making of cities and states? What penal codes, and why are there, high incarceration rates for some, but not others? But then also, what are the social norms, for family? You know, I talk about my family being a multi-generational Black family, right? My parents were married for 54 years. My grandparents were around, my uncles and aunts were around, my cousins were around. We come from a big family, so that's kind of what I know. But then I have to understand that I also have students who don't come from that, right? I also have friends and family who actually don't come from that. So I have to take all those understandings for myself, but not also bring that into when we're talking about race and color and culture. But we have to start looking, and that's what we mean by social dexterity. And when we use that model in the lens of the selfie, and then at the end of the day, we ask ourselves, so what? I see some of my students, you'll be talking to them and they give you that kind of, eye roll and head nod, be like, so what, Dr. Tease? What does all this mean? What are you trying to tell us? Well, you know what I'm saying is that when we start looking at these selfies and when we really start thinking about multiculturalism, when we start talking about diversity versus equity versus inclusion, we want to start taking that selfie so that we can not only start understanding how we view those things, but then how we relate those things to other people and how that might be viewed and related towards us in kind, right? And so we really take that selfie and that time to try to go through that cultural dexterity and then having a cultural competency to bring that together to really start looking at and focusing then on our intersections, right? So when we talk about intersections, Christine read my bio and talked about all the things that I've done, which didn't sound like me, but they were me. To the surprise of some people, I got it going on. I think just a little bit. I've done some stuff. But when you start thinking about that and when you start pulling that together and then you look at me, one of the things I tell people and one of the things that I think when we're looking at this practice and trying to go beyond the hashtag is that we're trying to understand too, that we have intersections and those intersections make up our identity. And the way that that's important and the way that it really helps us understand going beyond the hashtag and trying to get beyond single issue struggles is looking at all the intersections that make us up. And in doing so, that helps us, to not only define, but then talk about how we treat other people, right? Now, Kim Crenshaw has a very interesting take on intersectionality and oppression. And what she was looking at and when she was talking about intersectionality and oppression was based upon, how does that then intertwine when she was looking at women of color and discrimination that they face. And it was based on multiple issues of ethnicity, but it was also about background and it was also about sexuality.
Particularly those who haven't followed demarginalizing from its initial iteration often mistakenly think that intersectionality is only about multiple identities. I've got 3, you've got 6, the identity question goes on and on. Some colleagues in Germany undertook to count how many intersections there are. Last count, there were like 17 or something. It was an attempt to map them all. That's not, at least my articulation of intersectionality. Intersectionality is not primarily about identity. It's about how structures make certain identities the consequence of and the vehicle for vulnerability. So if you want to know how many intersections matter, you've got to look at the context. What's happening? What kind of discrimination is going on? What are the policies? What are the institutional structures that play a role in contributing to the exclusion of some people and not others? So there are multiple.
Cool. So I'm going to go back right there. So kind of what Kim was talking about, and she actually put some of that into, but she kind of put that into perspective for me, right? So she puts intersectionality and the intersections then back into context, right? Because she was looking at oppression. So then in that case where I in one sense said that, we have to start looking at those intersections so that we start looking at and understanding someone's identity. But at the same time, we have to look at those intersections in the way that she was talking about, which then explains to how people have been discriminated against, how people have been biased, the prejudice that we have and where they come from, in order for us to really then start expressing and understanding and getting back to that cultural competency. And then at the same time, building that cultural dexterity when we start taking those selfies to help us not only look at why do we think the way that we do, but why we may treat other people the way we do. But then at the same time, how do we want to be treated based upon who we are? So going into that, so that really was kind of the culmination and real quick run through of what we do when we do our inclusion zone trainings. And again, it's a more multicultural and focus. We then talk about, language, and that's the same thing that I'm going to do when I move over to this is more safe zone when we start talking about the LGBTQIA plus community and their culture, right? It's a huge and expansive culture. And so the same thing where when we look at multiculturalism and we start thinking about all the ways that people have been discriminated against based upon their ethnicity, right? Based upon where they're from and the bias that people have about that. We then also do kind of the same shift and dive into what then does it mean to be LGBTQIA in the community, on campus, and just general in life. And what does that mean? And what do people know about the, the ways of which that this has changed? And LGBT is a culture, right? It's a shared history, and it's been around for a long time compared to what some people might think. It's been for a long time, and history shows that it has been, and it's been definitely widespread across cultures. But one of the interesting things that I always find out when I'm talking about the LGBTQIA plus community, and mind you, it's a mouthful in trying to say it, but all the different iterations of what the letters mean. And normally, I would go through the diagram of what each means, but in relation to time, I'm not going to do that. But when you start looking at, each one of those letters has a significance, and each one of them pulls together, we've shortened it to to be LGBTQIA plus. Now, back in the day when I was a young kid walking through the snow 5 miles, and there was no electricity and all the other things that students are amazed that I grew up with. It used to be just gay and lesbian. And then at a certain part in time, I think the B came in, and then there was the T. And now there's the Q's, and there's the I's. And so, but in there, we also have to look at the fact that in the definition as it's gone on, and then why we added the plus was because there's more identities that are being added to what it means to be a part of this community and this culture. But there's also Two-Spirit. And Two-Spirit from a North American standpoint is about, those people from indigenous cultures who actually identify and personify both the male and the female persona. So a lot of times they talk about them possessing both traits and qualities, and they help raise children. They were the shamans, they were the caretakers and the healers. So it's a very fascinating and interesting look at how that then plays into, the LGBTQIA plus culture. But big on that too is understanding that, there's some umbrella terms with that, and queer being one of them. This is all housed under, the queer umbrella term. And you have to understand that for some people, queer is a bad word. Just like, we talk transgender, and we do a thing on transgender zone on NAU campus. And there's some words that we used to call transgender people by, that some transgender people are okay with and other people are not. So I think a lot of times when we're getting into this understanding and trying to understand the language as it pertains to LGBT, or whether it pertains to multiculturalism, sometimes it's about understanding how and who wants to be called what. And it's very tricky, and it's one of those things that you will always be faced with, because what works for one may not work for some. But at the same time, all the identities are then also intersecting. And one of the things that you can see here with the acronyms is that there's lots of different flags, right? And there's lots of different flags that represent aspects of the LGBTQIA community. And so, it's ever changing, it's ever evolving, and you just listen, you're aware, you take into what people are saying, and then you put that into your practice. And a lot of times it begins and starts with us understanding that, the words have power, right? And especially in this community, especially in the LGBTQIA plus community, words have power because it may be the case of how or not that you interact with someone, right? It's how it might make them offensive, defensive, right? And then for us on campus, when we're meeting with students, and students when they first come to campus, how they first come to campus sometimes may not be what they graduate. As they learn, they morph and they adapt and they start figuring out who they are and who they want to be and what careers they want to do. And all of that starts changing because when they come to the college campus environment, or when they come to the environment and there's all this information that's being thrown their way, they're having to adapt in ways that some of them may never have thought. I have students, even in this day, who've never been around Black people. I've had students who've never known that someone that was LGBT, or even going through the process of transitioning from either male to female or female to male, right? These are all things that we have to start thinking about so that we can then start treating people accurately. And part of that is also understanding that when we get into this area of safe zone and we get into the area of understanding the LGBTQIA plus community is one, we have to start understanding the notions and the ideas about sexual orientation and attraction, right? And because of that, we also have to understand that, attraction basically is about how one feels for something or for others. And in this instance, we are talking about physical and emotional and intellectual or romantic attraction, which is all somewhat different, and people can experience both, right? They can also experience only one, or some of them can experience none of them. And so we have to start understanding that when we start trying to understand members of the community, but we also have to look at, the differences between sex and gender. A lot of us, will make that a factor, but we have to understand as we're evolving and as we're thinking about what does it mean to be a member of this community. When we talk about sex, we're talking about characteristics that are assigned at birth, hormones, genitalia, chromosomes. But at the same time, when we're talking about gender, just like race, just like some of these are constructs, right? They're socially and culturally shaped by expressions in this case, or by society, excuse me. So we have to understand that gender and the way that it's played out is very different in some instances when we're talking about identity, right? And so when we talk about gender identity, we're talking about how someone sees themselves, right? I am a male. When I pronounce, I don't know if I used my pronouns, and if I didn't, shame on me, but my pronouns are he, him, and his, and I'll get to that in a second, but I am a cisgendered male. And what I mean by that is that if you can see the definitions on there, as a cisgendered male, I go by the characteristics that I was assigned at birth, right? My identity is of a male, and my expression is of a male by the way I dress, not necessarily profession, not necessarily the things that I like to do, because that gets into binaries that I'll talk about in a second. But my gender expression is male. The clothing that I wear, mostly. Which can be different for other people. And that can be a problem because you have some people who may not wear the clothing that basically identifies, how they see themselves. And that could be because of the environment that they're in. It could be about comfortability. So we have to look at that as a difference. And then under that, we also talk about trans, which that's short for transgender. And it's just it's an umbrella term that encompasses those people whose identity is across gender, and it's an ever-evolving term. And again, we're talking about the transition from either male to female, female to male. And in that, lastly, when we start looking at those identities and we're talking about the community, we also talk about the binaries. And so what you'll hear when we start talking about binary is that some people choose the binary of male, some people choose the binary of female, and then some of them have non-binaries, and they do not choose either because they basically are fluid and they go between the two. And how does that impact us? And when we start looking at the climate in our institution, for us, we have non-gendered bathrooms. And what that process was is that we're now basically having recognizing that our institution, our university, has students who are transgender, who may not always go by the binary of male or the binary of female, but on our college campus, let's say it's something like using the restroom. I don't know if you saw the film Hidden Figures, where it took her like 30 minutes just to go to the bathroom because she had to run from one end of the building to the other. We have the same kind of thing on our campus where transgender students, if they had to use the restroom, did not feel comfortable going into maybe the restroom that was assigned to them, that may have been assigned with them at birth, but not recognizes their gender expression or the binary that they choose. So we created gender neutral bathrooms that are now more centrally localized and centralized on campus so that we don't have that kind of thing. But when we're looking at that binder and we're looking at the attraction and how we're talking about all of these constructs of gender and orientation, on the slide, we do talk about restrooms. We talk about, how we dress our children, the toys that we play with, some of the jobs that we have, the use of makeup, the wearing of clothes, the names that we have. All these go into a thing of looking at our gender and how we relate to people. But the most important thing, and I'll go real quickly because of time, one of the things that we do is we talk about the use of pronouns. And so there's a big talk and a big push on campuses now, in campuses mostly, but I am seeing it now as you start going out into the public sector outside of the campus institution, is also understanding names, and it's about respect, right? Christine started off calling me Dr. Tease. People who don't know me call me Dr. Tease. My coworkers call me Dr. Tease, and I'm like, hey, I'm just Martin. But for my students, before we get to that, I want them to call me Dr. Tease, to respect those boundaries and those professional boundaries. But at the end of the day, I'm Martin, but that's fine. But then at the same time, I go by he, him, and his pronouns so that people know how I identify, right? And for some people, that is a big thing about respect, because if you misgender them, which is an issue and can be a problem, in our case, you may never get them again because we misgendered them. And some of this is that you also have to understand that when we do talk about pronouns and we get into pronouns, it just is a way of respect. It's a way of saying, I see you, identify you, and I see you the way that you want to be seen. A big thing for our campus, is that we also have what's called the dead name. And essentially what that is for people who are transitioning, they may not use the name that they were given at birth, and they may now take on or have assumed a new name as they transition. And so what we do on this campus is normally referred to as preferred name, but we don't like that, because when you say preferred name, that still kind of gives the context of like, I can call you what I want to call you versus you being called what you want to be called. So we talk about it in the form of asserted name, right? Your asserted name is now the name that you've chosen. And generally, when I think about this, it kind of takes me back to roots, the old classic, and you're thinking about Toby and Kunta Kinte, but it's kind of something very similar, but now we're talking about gender expression, and the process of changing. And so with the asserted name, our students now and our staff and faculty now have the ability to go into our admissions and our enrollment department and be enrolled under their asserted name and not their given name. And then we also do a process where we've done like a dead name funeral. So we buried all those aspects of the self that they used to be in order for us to then celebrate who they are today. And it's a process for us on campus. And on there, you can see kind of ways that they can go and do it. The only thing where there's a caveat and there's a hitch, which comes into like the legalities of it. So until they go to the courts, until they have like a legalized name change, we cannot change their birth name under the basis that their social security number, all their information that would be attributed to them being on campus would still be used. But their asserted name could go forward so that when they're in class, when they're out with other friends, people know to call them how they're called. And there's aspects of that we still work on with our transgender resources on campus. I talk about pronouns. We go by pronouns because we're also talking about respect. We talk about respect, but it's also a way of helping us to identify people. It's a great way when you walk into a room, to introduce yourself so people know. And, I'm going to tell you, in the sense that in trying to make this work and make it make sense, it was really interesting. I was on a call the other day, and the person who was talking let us know that they had transitioned from male to female. They identified as a lesbian. They had 4 children, and their wife was heterosexual. Now, why do I say all this in the sense of talking about pronouns? One of it was because of like, oh my gosh, this person said a mouthful. And even I, as a trainer in Inclusion Zone, as she was talking, I was like, wow, she said that she's a lesbian, she transitioned, she has 4 children, and her wife was heterosexual. Now, I'm kind of caught up on like, how is all this working, and how would I talk to this person had they come into my office? How do I understand? And as I'm going through all these processes, and my face is one where I don't hide things too well. But I'm still trying to figure it out, and I'm still trying to process, what does this mean? I missed the fact that this person transitioned later in life, after having 4 children with their wife, who was heterosexual, and that the wife was actually now the ex-wife because she was not lesbian. So it became an interesting thing. So I bring this up in this dynamic to kind of go and coincide with pronouns, because then it becomes, how then do we understand this person as they were telling their story? But more importantly, how do we use the pronouns and understanding their identity then to interact and continue any kind of possible engagement on an understanding of who they are and our understanding and our relation to that. So using pronouns basically help us, respect people, right? We talk about respect, we talk about the communication aspects of it. And again, it's just a way to let, and it's a way to let those students know, especially those students who are transitioning, those students whose identity and their gender expressions may not be what we think, kind of gives us, a understanding of who they might be and why they talk the way that they do. I see that for the nature of time, I may have about 10 minutes, so I'm not going to play that video. And I'll put it in the chat. But to kind of wrap this up and to get us into thinking, and Christine, if you're there, shout out if I'm running over or people have something, because I can't see the chat per se. But one of the things that when we talk about being a catalyst for change, we want to talk about being more than a hashtag. Again, takes that aspect of looking at cultural competency, right? Looking at how you're aware, looking about the knowledge, how you're relating to people, doing the selfie, and that self-discovery, right? When you do that selfie, it lets you know about those things about yourself that you may not have known, as it relates to other people, right? It's not a one-time thing, it's an ongoing thing. Our biases are ongoing things. The problem for some of us is that we may not know the difference between our conscious bias and our unconscious bias, right? And it could be something different based upon any different level of variation. And the other part of this is to move beyond the hashtags, to understand what we're talking about when it comes to inclusion, when it comes to even diversity, and then to equity, is to understand this is a continuous reevaluation, because it may be something different as you interact with people, right? Cultural and sexual dexterity is the new normal, right? So I love this quote where it talks about normal being an illusion, and at the same time, we have to think about what's normal for the spider is chaos for the fly, right? I think that is such a perfect quote to continue to think about what's going on when we're looking at, this dexterity, right? And then it's still continuing to understand and be there to understand and appreciate the differences in culture and gender identities and norms. At the same time, we're talking about that appreciation of normal not being quote unquote so normal, moving forward. One of the things during the course of last summer when people were protesting and rioting, everybody may not be able to riot. Everybody may not be able to go out there and protest, and everybody, may be trying to carry a banner that maybe they shouldn't be carrying because, they're woke, right? I love it. One of the things my brother says, that has me laughing and cracks me up every time is that he talks about, people being woke. And he says, I wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning, but I don't get out of bed until 8. So the meaning of that was to basically say, yeah, you can wake up and you can be knowledgeable and cognizant of some things, but you have to put it into action. So you have to get out there and do something. So one of the activities that we have when we do Inclusion Zone is we also look at the sphere of influence, right? When you sit at the table, where's your seat at the table? And in relationship to that, who's there? What do you feel like you can say? What do you feel like you can't say? And how do you interact with people, and their differences, right? And how do those impacts happen? We're talking about the accessibility of who you're talking to and why you might be talking to them. At the same time, we're always challenging this question and the notions of heteronormativity. And again, that's about being normal, and that's following like a certain rule of, heterosexual, Christian, male, family, kids, dogs, house, cat, all those things. Are those the bases to which, we've adapted as a society? So those things may not exist as they used to, or they may have taken on a new form. right? And at the same time, we always want people to think equity, right? Equality is good, but equity means that everyone, is succeeding on a level that evens the playing field per se, and in a way that's more inclusive and inducive to getting us to where we want to be for social justice, not necessarily just making do. And then, back again, as we just look at that, when we talk about the table and what can we do, and you're here at a conference and a leadership, to understand and to help kind of put these things into fruition, you take the training, you go to lectures, you go to forums, you go to events. We put on heritage programs. We do, civic duties, from voting. These are all ways that you can help yourselves get beyond hashtags, but also be, there for people. Because again, the key for me, if nothing else was said, if nothing else makes sense, and what I said was to look at the fact that we want you to be aware of your surroundings, aware of what's going on, so that no matter what position you choose, whether it's allyship or advocacy, if not both, you understand why you're doing it and where you're doing it from, and what the basis of how that interrelates with you, but then how you're relating with other people. From there, our key takeaway, again, the awareness, the advocacy, and the allyship portion, but also is to value difference, right? To value the fact that, I might be different from you. I may come from a different walk of life from you, but at the same time, I may be very much like you, right? And those differences may make us more similar, which is kind of an oxymoron to say that, but that may make us similar in our understanding of not only who we are and what we are. And this is the basis from the outer shell, which goes back into what I was saying, my influence when I did my selfie. But then when I did that selfie and then I start looking at me, how all those things are interrelated, right? And how they work not only for me as I talk about myself, but then how I relate and understand other people. I think I left us with a little bit of time if there's any questions or comments, but if you want more information about what we do at NAU, if some of you are thinking about coming to NAU, certainly feel free to email me. Our main email address is inclusion@nau.edu, but I'm also martin.tease@nau.edu. And I will open it up if there's any questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Dr. Martin, for such a great session. It was really insightful and it left us a lot to think about. We did have some questions in the comments. And the first one is where they could find the graphic that you had on your slides. It was the one with the LGBTQ+, and it had two spirits on it at the end.
I can put it back in. I can speak today. It's Friday. I gave the organizers a couple of slides and videos that hopefully it would be attached. But if not, I can put it back into. If there's a wall, I can put it in there. Or I think I saw a resource section. If I can put it in there, I'll put it in there. If not, again, if there's anyone who wants it, if they would like to email me at martin.tease@nau.edu, I can forward them the slides or the videos that weren't put there.
Okay, awesome. As in addition to that, the session is recorded, so if you want to go back and watch it later, you can always take a screenshot of it as well. Our second question is, what is the best way to ask someone what their pronouns are?
That's a great question, and generally, you either start off by saying them. So when I'm meeting with someone or even in large conversations, I start off with what my pronouns are. And then I ask people to either state them. If I was on a Zoom call, one of the things that we do is we ask people who are on the Zoom call to rename themselves and then also state what their pronouns are. And sometimes you just have to wait for them to do it.
Okay, and our last question is, that binary and non-binary is something they find confusing and difficult to understand. Could you explain and even provide a definition?
Again, if you go, all right for them swamping me with a question on a Friday. So if we're talking about the binary, I'll go back into it as far as the definition of sex and gender. And generally, when we're talking about the binaries, we're talking about who and what you were assigned at birth. So again, I'm a male. I was born a male, and I was born a male and assessed a male based upon, genitalia, chromosomes, blah, 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 blah. And so therefore, when we get into that cisgendered nature of the binary, then we're talking about how then that then is assigned to me and what I go by. So, and I'm sorry, you stumped me with trying to think of what the actual question is. And normally my family would go Google it, but I don't have Google at the time. But if it makes sense, it's really about you understanding, how you were assigned and the characteristic that you were assigned at birth. And then is that what you go by? So if we talk about the binary of male and female, it's because you've been assigned chromosomes, the genitalia at birth. But then if it's non-binary, the non-binary aspect of it is if you don't go by that. So even though you may have, male genitalia or you may have female genitalia, but let's say you're in the process of transitioning, and mostly that's where it's talked about. And I do think there's instances where there are people who aren't transitioning, they just don't go by those labels. And I think that's kind of where it gets confusing, because some people just don't go by the label and they don't follow the set of practice that makes sense. But the whole non-binary aspect of it is one who does not talk about themselves and the male and the female perspective, if that makes sense.
All right, thank you again, Dr. Martin. We had a lot of interest in this, and I want to thank all the participants for coming and for having such insightful and thoughtful questions and comments. The Inclusive Leadership Conference would love to know what you thought about this session. As always, you could always do so by rating the session down below, and any feedback and insightful is always helpful to both ILC and Dr. Martin. So please give it up in the chat one more time for Dr. Martin Tease.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for listening. I hope it made sense. If it does not, again, feel free to email me. I love having the conversation and keep it going. And congrats on the conference. And I hope everyone does well and have a great weekend.
Thank you. Have a great weekend too. Don't forget to participate in the games and post on the wall to earn prizes. I heard there's a rumor that you do not want to miss them. Also, again, follow us on social media at TU Leadership, at Temple Diversity, and at Klein Go. And with that, that concludes our session. So please make sure to meet us later today at 5:30 for Radical Truth Telling with Marissa Lai Ping.
Cool. Thank you.